The German delegation arrived at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919, knowing exactly what they were about to sign. They had been given the treaty's terms 6 weeks earlier, and had spent those weeks filing written objections, 443 pages of them, that the Allied powers largely ignored. Germany's newly democratically elected head of government, Philipp Scheidemann, had already resigned rather than put his name on it. He called the treaty a murderous plan, and said he would rather lose his hand than sign it. His successor was sent in his place, because the alternative presented by the Allies was simple and brutal: sign or the war resumes. When the German foreign minister, Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau, received the terms in May, he addressed the Allied leaders directly. "We can sense the full force of hatred that confronts us here," he told them. "You demand from us to confess we were the only guilty party of the war. Such a confession in my mouth would be a lie." They signed anyways. They had no choice. What they signed would strip Germany of 13% of its territory, 6 million of its people, all of its overseas colonies, its entire navy, and most of its army. It would demand reparations equivalent in modern terms to hundreds of billions of dollars. And it would formally declare, in writing, before the entire world, that Germany alone had caused the war. John Maynard Keynes, one of the most important economists of the 20th century, who attended the conference as part of the British delegation and resigned in protest of what he saw, called the treaty a Carthaginian peace. He warned that it would destroy the German economy, destabilize European politics, and make another war not merely possible, but likely. He was right on all 3 counts. The peace treaty was shaped by 3 men above all others, each pulling in different directions, and the document that emerged was the product of those competing tensions, which is to say, it was the worst possible combination of all 3 positions. Woodrow Wilson had come to Paris with his 14 points, a framework for a just and lasting peace built on national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations that would resolve future disputes without a war. Wilson believed Germany could be reformed rather than punished. He believed an amalgamation peace would produce a stable democracy. He was also increasingly ill, politically weakened at home, and systematically outmaneuvered by men who had been doing European politics since before he entered the academia. Georges Clemenceau had watched German armies invade France twice in his lifetime, in 1870 and in 1914. He had lived through the Siege of Paris. He had seen what German industry and military power could do when unleashed against France. He was 78 years old, had survived an assassination attempt, and was operating from a simple conviction: Germany had to be weakened so completely and so permanently that it could never threaten France again. He called Wilson's 14 points naive. God himself was content with 10 commandments, Clemenceau reportedly said. Wilson modestly proposes 14. David Lloyd George occupied the uncomfortable middle, personally skeptical of the harshest treatment, privately worried about what Keynes was telling him about the economic consequences, but politically constrained by a British electorate that had just returned him to power on the promise of making Germany pay. "Squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak," one of his colleagues had said during the electoral campaign. The British public wanted punishment. Lloyd George delivered it while occasionally flinching. Germany had signed the armistice on November 11, 1918, expecting a negotiated peace based off Wilson's 14 points, which had been publicly endorsed by the Allied powers. What arrived instead was a document their delegation was given no meaningful opportunity to contest. presented, as the Germans immediately pointed out, not as a negotiated treaty, but as a dictated one. They called it Der Diktat. The word stuck. Of all the weapons embedded into the Treaty of Versailles, none cut deeper into Germany's national consciousness than Article 231. The War Guilt Clause, as it was immediately and permanently nicknamed, did not use the word guilt. Its authors were careful lawyers who understood they were writing a legal instrument. What it did was require Germany to formally accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. This was the legal foundation for determining reparations. If Germany caused the war, Germany owed compensation for its cost. To ordinary Germans, and to the German government, and to most German historians, the clause was a lie, not a contested interpretation. A lie. Germany had not started the war alone. The July crisis of 1914 had involved the miscalculations, mobilization orders, and belligerence of Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain, as well as Germany. The idea that a war involving every major European power had been caused solely by one of them was, at a minimum, a profound distortion of a complex historical process. Germany spent the next 15 years trying to prove this. The Weimar government released nearly 60,000 official documents in an attempt to demonstrate that the war's guilt was shared. By the 1930s, most serious historians outside of France had concluded the responsibility for 1914 was indeed collective. The clause was, in the judgment of much of the academic world, historically indefensible. But it was in the treaty, signed, permanent, and it was used to justify everything else. Because if Germany had caused the war, Germany owned the cost of the war, and the cost of the war was a figure so large it stunned even the men who said it. The Reparations Commission met in 1921 and fixed the total at 132 billion gold marks, approximately 33 billion US dollars at the time, or the equivalent of roughly $400 billion today. John Maynard Keynes had already told the British government the figure was economically insane, that the German economy simply could not generate sufficient export surplus to make transfers of that magnitude, and that trying to force it would destroy not just Germany, but the European trading system that Britain itself depended on. Germany did not finish paying these reparations until October 3, 2010, 92 years after the war ended. The last payment was 70 million euros in interest on bonds issued in the 1920s. The war that ended in 1918 was being paid for in the 21st century. The territorial terms were designed with deliberateness that went beyond the requirements of the post-war adjustment. They were designed to hurt. Alsace-Lorraine, the province Germany had taken from France after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, returned to France. This was broadly accepted as legitimate, even by many Germans. But the Polish corridor was different. A strip of German territory was carved out and handed to the newly reconstructed Poland, giving it access to the Baltic Sea, and in the process, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany entirely. The city of Danzig, overwhelmingly German in population, was made a League of Nations free city rather than give to Poland or return to Germany. The Rhineland, German soil, was demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops as a buffer zone. Germany's overseas colonies in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific were stripped away and handed to Allied powers as League of Nations mandates. The pretense was international administration. The reality was that Britain and France absorbed most of them into their own empires. Germany's colonial territories were not liberated, they were redistributed. And then there was the military. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men, a figure so small that it could not defend Germany's borders, let alone threaten anyone else's. No tanks, no aircraft, no submarines. The general staff, the intellectual center of Germany's military thinking for a century, was dissolved. The German Navy was to be surrendered to the British. When German naval officers learned their fleet would not be returned, they scuttled 50 ships at Scapa Flow on June 21, 1919, sending the German High Seas Fleet to the bottom of the ocean rather than handing it over. It was the largest deliberate scuttling of warships in history. The British were furious. The Germans considered it an act of honor. It was also a preview, in its defiance, in its nationalism, in its absolute refusal to accept humiliation passively, of what was coming. The Germany that signed the Treaty of Versailles was not the same Germany that had fought the war. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire was gone. In its place stood the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy. A government born in the chaos of military defeat, immediately saddled with the political consequences of a treaty it had no hand in negotiating. This was not accidental. The Allied powers required Germany's new civilian democratic government to sign the treaty, not the military leadership that had actually fought the war. Field Marshal Hindenburg and General Ludendorff, who had commanded the German armies, walked away from the defeat with their reputations largely intact. The democratic politicians who signed the armistice and the peace treaty were immediately accused of having stabbed Germany in the back, surrendering a war that the army had not actually lost on the battlefield. The Todesstoßen, the stab in the back myth, was false. Germany had lost the war militarily, its armies exhausted, its reserves depleted, its allies collapsed one by one, its home front near revolution. But the myth was politically irresistible. It gave the German right a narrative. The army had not been defeated, it had been betrayed, and the men who betrayed it had signed the diktat. The Weimar Republic spent its entire existence trying to govern under conditions the treaty made nearly impossible. The reparation burden consumed German fiscal capacity. When Germany fell behind on payments in 1923, France and Belgium invaded and occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract payments directly. The German government responded by printing money to pay striking workers who refused to collaborate. The result was hyperinflation in 1923, which wiped out the savings of the German middle class in a matter of months. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice daily and sent their wages home by messenger before money lost its value. A wheelbarrow of banknotes would not buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, the social backbone of any functioning democracy, was economically annihilated. The economy stabilized in the mid-1920s with American loans, but the Great Depression of 1929 destroyed the fragile recovery. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed. The democratic parties that had governed the Republic were discredited by their association with the diktat and by their inability to protect the ordinary German from economic catastrophe. The political extremes, communist on one side, National Socialist on the other, grew with every election. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had made his political career on a single promise. He would tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German honor. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles had been chosen deliberately. In January 1871, following France's crushing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto von Bismarck had chosen that room, the grandest room in the grandest palace in France, to proclaim the new German Empire. it had been France's most humiliating moment of the 19th century. The French chose the same room in 1919 to dictate the peace terms to Germany. The symbolism was intentional. The message was clear. The circle of humiliation had been completed. John Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation and went home to write The Economic Consequences of the Peace, one of the most prolific books of the 20th century. He warned that the treaty would impoverish Germany, destabilize European politics, and produce conditions in which dangerous political movements would flourish. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, he wrote, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Even some of those who negotiated the treaty recognized, almost immediately, what they had done. Harold Nicholson, a young British diplomat at the conference, wrote in his diary he felt ashamed of the terms, and that the German delegation's distress at signing was painful. Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, who had actually won the war militarily, looked at the treaty and said, "This is not a peace, this is an armistice of 20 years. He was wrong by only 65 days. World War II began 20 years and 65 days after the treaty was signed. Hitler did not come to power because of the Treaty of Versailles alone. The rise of Nazism had multiple causes: economic depression, institutional failure, the specific pathologies of German nationalism, the cynicism of conservative elites who thought they could use Hitler and control him. No single cause produces a historical catastrophe of that magnitude. But the Treaty of Versailles provided the fuel. It gave a furious, humiliated, economically desperate population a genuine grievance. A peace that genuinely had been unjust, genuinely had been punitive beyond any economic logic justified, genuinely had been designed as much to humiliate as to secure. Hitler did not invent the German rage at Versailles. He found it, already burning, and threw everything he had on the fire. The statesmen at Paris in 1919 were not stupid men. They had been warned by Keynes, by their own advisors, by the German delegation's 443 pages of objections, what the consequences of their choices might be. They chose anyways. Clemenceau wanted Germany broken. He got what he wanted, and 20 years later, what he had broken came back together under the worst possible leadership and tore the world apart again. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors, June 28, 1919, did not merely fail to prevent the Second World War. By most serious historians' assessment, it made it nearly inevitable. Field Marshal Foch called it an armistice of 20 years. He should have been remembered as a pessimist. Instead, he was almost exactly right.